Hello. How's everyone doing? Great. So this talk here is testing, a love story. I love testing, so it makes sense for me to talk about it, right? Below some of my contact stuff, GitHub and Twitter. A little bit about myself here as the introduction in the material set. I'm the director of engineering at a company called Budget Dumpster. We're located in suburban Cleveland. I can talk to you more about what we do. I only have a half hour here, so I'm not going to spend too much time on that. I'm a father and a musician. I wrote a book that came out about a year and a half ago, about integrating web services with OAuth and PHP. And I'm a diehard Cubs fan. I was at World Series Game 1 and got to meet my childhood hero while wearing a unicorn shirt and pink Chucks. And suspenders, if you didn't notice those too. So it was a pretty exciting day for me. Just to kind of go over what we're going to talk about, we're going to talk a little bit about why I love testing. We're going to talk about the types of automated tests that you have at your disposal. We're going to talk about a little bit on when to use those types of tests, and then we're going to define some characteristics of a good test. I normally only give my testing talks at PHP conferences, which allows me to get really granular into code and examples and stuff like that. But I'm sure not everyone here is a PHP developer, so probably wouldn't be all that helpful for the rest of everyone. So this is a little bit of kind of what you can expect from the talk. My goals for you as the audience are to make sure when we get done that you at least understand the benefits of testing. You understand the types of tests and what they do for you, what value they provide you, and that you understand the characteristics of a good test. And we're going to talk a little bit at the end about putting together a testing strategy. Why I love automated tests. So up till about 2010, I had never written a test in my life. I'd followed all these people on Twitter that talked about testing, and they were super into it, and they were able to talk about the benefits of a good test suite for their code base. And I started feeling a little bit left out. And so I started being mentored by a testing guy in the PHP community, Chris Harchis, the grumpy programmer. Not sure if you guys... He's a good follow on Twitter anyway. And so he started kind of taking me through how to start testing, strategies for testing, starting a new project with tests, strategies for implementing tests into existing code that doesn't have tests. And I learned a lot from him. Some of the biggest takeaways that I got from that whole period of time, I guess it was about a year and a half that I worked with him, predictability. I know one of the most soul-stealing moments is when you are at work and you have a feature that's supposed to launch, and it launches and there's something wrong with it, and you don't know, and your bosses are telling you have to stay late, and you can't leave until it's fixed. You have no tests in place, so you're kind of just digging through the code base, digging through all the new code that you wrote, hoping that the bug that you wrote was in the new code and you didn't introduce a bug somewhere else. And so I put a lot of value, especially with all my other interests and with being a dad, I put a lot of value on my work-life balance, which means I don't want to work a 16-hour day in the office, whether something broke or not. So I found in order for me to be able to get to that place where my work-life balance was good and I was able to do the things that I enjoyed and not just totally burn out from work, as I started adding tests, I got a better feel for how my code's going to respond before it's live. I could run the test suite. I could run all the test suites to make sure that any of the code that I wrote for a new feature or even a bug fix didn't affect anything else down the line. The other big part of it, too, is I know if my code is failing properly. I think that's one of the easy things to kind of gloss over when you talk about testing. Am I catching all the exceptions that I need to catch? How am I handling cases where the input isn't what I expected? Am I basically failing in a way that's not going to freak my user out or freak my ops staff out. And then the other piece of it too is I can model specific situations for every piece of my code. So I can set up tests that are going to say, they're going to run down the happy path and say the user knows exactly what they're doing. They put in all the right information. Here's what's supposed to happen. I can model a situation where the user doesn't really know what they're doing and they give me wrong inputs, and I can give them a helpful error message to tell them what they did wrong. So predictability was a huge part of that, and if I know when I finish that last test, that last piece of code right before the feature goes out, I can leave at 5 o'clock and have a much higher level of confidence that I'm not going to get a phone call a half hour later asking me to log in or to come back in. The other part of it is debugging. So if you have predictability, right, you know all the sections of the code that you have are broken out into tests. I hate littering my code with var dumps or whatever the requisite debugging stuff is in like Ruby and Python and stuff like that. But I hate printing and exiting and doing all that stuff in my code because invariably at some point I'm going to forget to remove one of those statements and it's going to show up somewhere. So I use a test as a way to kind of identify different parts of the code. I write the test to the best knowledge that I have of how the code's supposed to work, and then augment them as I get new information. If I know the scenario or the symptom, I can run the test for that area of code and find the problem faster. I know that's probably one of, as developers in general, one of our biggest pain points is getting bug reports from non-technical people, right? Like, it doesn't work. All right, what doesn't work? Well, I tried to do it and it didn't work. Okay, I'm going to need a little bit more information than that. So sometimes that's pulling teeth. I don't have a fix for that. Unfortunately, if I did, I'd probably be in pretty good shape, but I don't. And then again, to my previous point, once I fix the problem that my tests have identified, I can also confirm that I didn't introduce a regression somewhere else in the code base, which is really handy and saves a lot of time. Training. That's not my dog, but it is a cute dog. I think this is probably one of the more under talked about aspects of testing from my experiences anyway. You bring somebody new on staff and they're a PHP developer or a Ruby developer and they have some experience, and so your first task is, okay, get familiar with the code. Start reading the code, start reading through the documentation, start figuring out how you're going to work with this code base. The tests provide a little bit more context for the code base. So in addition to that new employee or contractor or whoever reading through your code base, they can complement it with the test case that show exactly what each scenario for that class or that method is supposed to be. And it provides the working examples of, oh, here's how I call this method. Here's some things that it may seem obvious, and there's a lot of cases where it probably is. But again, having a new developer being able to run the test suite and see it working and read through that code as well helps a lot. And it just, in my experience, it shortens the amount of time that it takes to get somebody up to speed. You don't have somebody kind of sitting there reading through old code that maybe isn't as clean as you'd like it to be, but you haven't found the time to go back and clean it up. The tests really do provide a good, solid platform for somebody to get started with your code base. So how many of you work in a test-centric environment? Okay, not very many. Well, that's awesome. That means you have a really cool opportunity. So when I say test-centric environment, some of the things that I guess I'm referring to are, when you write code, do your commits require tests to go with them before they can get merged in? If you're doing automatic deployment, CI/CD. Is there a build process that runs all your tests and does all that kind of stuff? Or does anyone any of the people that raise their hands, any of the 5 of you, do like TDD or BDD in any sort of like formalized way? Okay, those are acronyms you hear a lot, and honestly I think it's a really good way to get started. Making the testing, I guess, culture. I don't like that word, but I'm going to use it anyway. A little bit more understandable and processized. I think that's at least helpful for getting started, and then you can drop as much of that as you need to once everyone's kind of up to speed. But the main reason that I love unit testing is that programming is hard, and tests made me a better programmer. Now, I don't know if it actually impacted my skill at all. I'm assuming it did, because I think, again, it's a useful practice. But I was writing code that had less bugs than I was previously. And so whether or not I actually became a better programmer or not, all the people around me whose opinions that I cared about, namely the people signing my paychecks, thought I was a better developer. So it worked out pretty well for me. And again, I think from a place of total honesty, I really do feel like understanding the process and kind of going through it and taking my lumps as I was learning did make me a better overall programmer. So I want to dig in a little bit here to the types of tests that we have at our disposal. Basically, the 3 that I'm going to touch on are unit tests, functional behavioral tests, I kind of lump those together, and integration tests. I'll tell you right now that most of the work that I've done has kind of been centered around the unit tests and functional behavioral tests. I've done some integration testing before, but basically these are kind of the 3 test types that we're going to use towards the end to kind of build out a strategy for, again, if you're a freelancer, if you work for a company. I know there's probably some conversations around that, like, hey, boss, we're going to take an extra 30% more time to write tests. And they're like, oh, sweet, man. Probably not. So let's dive in here. Okay. So a unit test actually has a pretty descriptive title. The one point of confusion I see with these all the time is people will automatically assume that a unit is a method or a class. The definition kind of states that a unit is the smallest testable component of an application. So if the smallest testable component of an application that you have is 17 classes that are all like slammed together, that's your unit, and you can still test that. You may want to look at that and go, man, writing this test is really hard, and I'm not getting a whole lot of really good information out of it when it fails because there's so many components. But it at least gives you that information to know, okay, I need to break this out into smaller components that I can test. It's really granular. I found that they're the most expensive in terms of time tests to write, just because, again, you're going through these components of code and trying to run through all the scenarios that you can think of, good inputs, bad inputs, no inputs, anything you can think of to try to see how your code responds to it. But they also give you the most specific, focused information back. So I prefer to be heavier on the unit test side and then to kind of augment with the other types of tests. But again, the unit tests are a very, very valuable tool to kind of have in your tool belt, and probably the most difficult conversation that you'll have to have with your bosses if you're not currently doing them. Functional behavioral tests, right? So they test kind of what they say, right? They test the specific function or behavior of the application. So where a unit may be a single method in a class or, a single class, functional or behavioral test is going to take an actual user action. So logging in, creating a user, Those are like the only two really, really general things that are coming to mind right now. They're not as granular as unit tests. There's ways, depending on, again, what language you have and what tools that language offers you, to actually get help in writing some of these tests, right? So, has anyone ever heard of gherkin or cucumber as a language, I guess? Right, they allow you to write these tests in a very logical, plain English way, right? So they're like, given that I'm a user of the system, when I put in my username and password and click the submit button, I'm logged into the system, and you can write your tests like that. Your marketing staff or your sales staff or whoever else you have there that maybe isn't as technical can actually help you write those tests. They can help you walk through those scenarios and figure out what should happen, what shouldn't happen. So, again, very, very valuable to have. The last one is integration tests, right? I saw that. I was looking at signs this morning trying to find the right slides for these. And I don't know, I saw that one. I saw that one and I thought it was really funny. So the integration tests are basically going to show how different units of code integrate together, right? Again, that doesn't mean every piece of code should integrate with every other piece of code in your system. It just means the places where it makes sense. An example I like to use is, you have a database layer, whether you're using an ORM or active record or whatever, you have some sort of database layer. If you find that you're having to write specific code for each type of model that you have, you're going to get to a point where you go, okay, this isn't really helping me out. I'm rewriting a lot of code. I'm creating a lot more work for myself. So, like in a case like this, your strategy might be, I'm going to create a database layer that'll take whatever I give it and know what to do with it. It'd be a good case for an integration test. I can pass it, a user model or a project model or an issue model or a make-in model. That was a joke. And again, it's helpful if you have really, if you're writing extensible contract-driven implementations, using a lot of interfaces or abstract classes, things that you're writing a contract for that you're expecting other pieces of code to be able to interact with. And it helps identify issues, not with the units of code themselves, but in how they cooperate. So when should I use these type of tests, right? So again, because my brain wasn't working super well this last week, the best example that I kind of came up with was creating a user, right? Most systems have users, so it's a pretty relatable thing. So that's another joke. Sorry, I like that one. So what I like to do as we step through a process, like I like to break out what needs to happen in English and then kind of take those little components and figure out how many classes do I need, what do I need them to do, are the responsibilities separated enough to where I'm not going to run into issues down the road. And so for a unit test, right, for creating a user, we know that we would need a representation of the user data. There's a form that's being filled out somewhere. They're putting in their username, password, email, whatever. We also know, because we're very security-minded from the get-go, that we want to make sure that we're validating and sanitizing user data if we need to, as we need to, right? And then we know that we're going to have to persist the user's data. We're going to have to store it somewhere, whether it's a database, whether it's being sent to an API or being pulled from an API or being stored in Redis or Memcache or something like that. Creating a user from a functional behavioral standpoint, right, is a little bit different. We're not as granular. We're looking at the user navigates to a page, presumably the create a new user page. A user fills out the form with all the details and submits the form, and then the user receives some sort of indication of whether or not their request was successful. So again, we're looking at this more from a user standpoint as opposed to from a code standpoint. And again, with the integration test, again, because it's not tied to just a user, I don't know why I picked Archer. I think I just got lazy. We're going to look at the actual persistence of the data, right? So are the mechanisms for persisting the data separate from the data type? So if I'm passing a user into the database layer and then I pass in an issue into the database layer, is everything going to be cool, or am I going to have to do, a user database or, user record, project record, item record, whatever? Again, and these tests are pretty easy in the sense of wrapping your head around them in terms of like, I can test if the persistence is working well by passing other data types to it and making sure that the data is being saved properly. There's I don't know if it's a debate, maybe it's just a difference of opinion when it comes to interacting with databases and things like that in your tests. I'm kind of firmly in the camp of don't unless you have to. There's some people that'll say you never should, it's always bad, and there's some people that'll say, hey, it's no big deal, you always should, why the hell not? I think it's valuable. I think there are situations where it's valuable to do that. When you get into these type of tests, you kind of have to, right? If you're testing persistence and you want to make sure that the database is storing the records from different models or different data types correctly, you kind of have to store them. I could go into I actually have an hour-long talk just about mocking in PHP Unit. It's really exciting. I won't go into that a whole lot now. What I would say about that is having tests is better than not having tests. You can always go back and fix your tests or improve your tests later. I would say if that's an argument that you've heard or something you're trying to kind of decide, I really need to learn all the ins and outs about mocking before I write any test, I would say don't worry about it. Do what you have to do. Make sure you're not doing it in your production database. Make sure you have a copy, a test database where you can alter some of the records. But I would say just go for it. Dig in. If you're saving stuff to a test database, so be it. Fix it later. The value, I think, is definitely more in having the test than, the philosophy behind how you're doing it. Again, writing good tests, it's a lot like goals, actually. Like if you think about, what is it, SMART goals? Good tests are focused, right? They're looking at one piece of code at a time. I've come across tests where people are trying to test too many things in one test, and it kind of gets some of those benefits of having that as, training material or providing clarity to other programmers goes away when you start making your tests really, really long and trying to do too many things. Again, with focused, I guess specific is kind of the same thing, right? They're focused on a specific thing. That should be one bullet point. Simple, right? A lot of the code that we have to write can be complex. It can be difficult to understand. My goal when I write code is pretty much always to simplify. If I can make something easier to read, if I can take a loop out, or if I can take a nested if statement out and make the code easier to read, I'm going to try to do that. Kind of goes with the last point of avoiding control statements and logic as much as possible. If your tests have a lot of if statements, the loops, depending on what you have available to you as a testing framework, I can understand a little bit more, but having a bunch of if statements or ternary statements in your test should be kind of a red flag that, hey, maybe I'm trying to do a little bit too much here. I want to keep it simple. And if I'm using an if statement, to me that's saying, okay, I have another test for a different case. I have a couple pro tips. Not that I'm a pro, but that's what people say, so I'm going to use that phrase. I think this is where some of the more practical aspects come into play here. If you don't have existing tests, right? So that's the thing. How do I get started? How do I go from having no tests? Like, I see the value. You've made a very compelling case here today. I want to start doing this. How do I do it, right? Write tests for bugs as you fix them. It's the easiest way. There's going to be that temptation to say, we're going to take 2 months and we're just going to go through the whole entire code base and make sure that all of the methods and functions and classes and everything has unit tests and we have 100% code coverage. Like, that's an awesome state of mind to be in, but I would discourage you from doing that. It's going to get really frustrating and probably not go as well as you hope that it will. With using bugs or even small features, anything new that you're writing, you can start to wrap in tests, and again, kind of slowly over time, making sure that you're writing good tests. You're not just trying to knock out a huge block of them. It's going to help you ensure that bug is fixed, and as you start adding more and more and more tests, you're going to start seeing those benefits of being able to identify regressions and things like that. I'd mentioned this before. Look into test-driven development and behavior-driven development as a way to formalize your testing process. In short, test-driven development is basically writing your test before you write your code and then running your code against your test. It helps kind of identify what's supposed to happen up front, lets you write the test for that scenario, and then make sure that your code passes that test. It kind of takes some of the influence or some of the differences that you might come up with in your mind as you're writing the code first. Again, I'm not a huge subscriber to it, but I do think it is helpful, especially for teams that are just getting started. As far as creating a strategy, right, you want to strategize and diversify. You could spend all your time writing unit tests, and you could have this great suite of unit tests that are 100% coverage, everything's green, everything's great. Those aren't going to cover everything, right? You're still going to have user interface. You're still going to have functions that your users have to do on your application or on your website. Use the behavioral tests. Use the integration tests. Sit down with your team. And, this isn't something you just jump into and say, hey, you write a bunch of unit tests, you write a bunch of integration tests, and, dude, we're going to be sweet. This is a conversation you sit down with your team, with the stakeholders in your company, with your bosses, and you say, hey, what are the most important components of our application? What are the components that make us money? What are the steps that we expect our users to go through? And allow the team to kind of come together using all the knowledge that they have and all the experience that they have to formulate a strategy that utilizes unit tests, that utilizes behavioral and functional tests, and integration tests when necessary. Right? I mentioned that one earlier. Adding tests to your code review process. How many of you do formal code reviews as part of your... Okay, a handful. If you have any influence over that at all, or can make a suggestion at work at all, code reviews are awesome. Just having a fresh set of eyes to help kind of look over your code and help identify issues before they become part of the code base is awesome. And adding your tests to the code review process, and I don't mean just running them, I mean having another developer read through your tests and make sure that they understand what you're doing and why you're doing it. And again, them having the ability to ask questions about why you're doing what you're doing is an extremely valuable thing to have. Again, find a testing strategy that works for you. If you start following a lot of the testing talk on Twitter or Reddit or other social networks, you're going to get a lot of opinion. Not to say that those opinions aren't valid or aren't good, but the whole idea of this is that you find something that works for you in the situation that you're in with the team that you have, and that you can implement it in a way that's going to add value, right? Being able to do everything by the book according to whoever is great, but if it doesn't add any value to your team, it's pointless, and you're probably going to end up taking value away from your team. So that's all I have. I want to thank all the organizers and all you guys for coming out. Make sure you give them a big hand and share your appreciation with them. I did want to point out, too, that we're hiring. So if you're in the Cleveland area or I was going to say would like to be, but wouldn't mind being, find me afterwards. I can tell you a little bit about what we do and what we're looking for, and just kind of go from there. But again, thank you for listening, and enjoy the rest of the conference.